You know, for most of my life, I thought I had it all figured out. I worked hard, did everything I was supposed to do, get a good job, build a family, buy a house. And for a long time, that was enough. I thought that was the dream, the finish line. I had a good career, a wife I loved, Emma, and everything on the surface looked great. But somewhere along the way, I started feeling like something was missing. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I had the house, the job, the life everyone says you're supposed to have. But every day, I felt like I was running in circles. Like I was living someone else's version of success. I wasn't happy, but I didn't know how to admit it. I'd built this perfect little world, but inside, I felt like it was falling apart. Maybe you've been there. Maybe you've had that nagging feeling, like no matter what you do, no matter how hard you work, something still isn't right. You've got the money, the status, the security, but it doesn't fill the hole inside you. You start to question if this is all there is, and that's when you start to wonder if you've made a mistake. I'd been pushing through, convincing myself that things would get better. But deep down, I knew I wasn't living the life I really wanted. And I started to feel that same emptiness in Emma too. I loved her. I thought I always would. But lately, it felt like she was slipping away from me. Not in a dramatic way, not in some obvious, terrible moment, but in the small, everyday ways. She was changing. Her interests were shifting. I could see it, but I couldn't understand it. We were drifting apart, and I didn't know what to do about it. I think it's easy to get caught up in the idea that having everything on paper means everything is perfect. But the truth is, sometimes it's not. Sometimes you're stuck in a life you thought was right, but deep down, it's not enough, and that's when the real question hit me. If I'm not happy, and Emma's not happy, what do I do next? I spent most of my life chasing what I thought was the perfect life. I had the idea in my head that if I just worked hard enough, if I played by the rules, I'd end up where I was supposed to be. It wasn't even a question for me. I just assumed that the harder I worked, the more I could provide, the more I could give Emma and I the life we both wanted. But somewhere along the line, it started to feel like I was building a life I didn't even recognize anymore. We had the house, the security, everything that I thought meant success. And yet, I kept feeling like I was missing something. I remember when I first met Emma. We had dreams, you know? We used to talk about what we'd do with our lives, where we'd travel, what we'd create together. Back then, it was all possibilities. We both believed that we could make it all happen, that our life together would be our adventure. But as time passed, something shifted. I thought all I needed to do was focus on the next step, the next goal. But no matter how much I achieved, I still felt that something was slipping away. And I realized, I wasn't even sure what I was chasing anymore. It was like I was checking boxes on some list that someone else wrote. And the worst part was, I didn't know how to stop. I thought the dream was simple: get the job, get the house, get the family, and then everything just falls into place. But it didn't. It felt more like a race to nowhere. And Emma, well, she wasn't the same either. She was still here, but I could feel the distance growing. She wasn't talking about our future like she used to. I knew she had her own dreams, her own passions, but they were starting to feel like a world apart from mine. It wasn't her fault. She was changing, and I was changing. But I wasn't ready for it. And worse, I wasn't sure if I even knew who I was anymore. I started to wonder, is this really the life I wanted, or just the one I thought I should have? I began asking myself hard questions. Was I happy? Was she? And how do you go from having everything to realizing that it isn't enough? It wasn't just me. Emma was changing too. It started small at first, little things. She'd spend more time in her studio, painting. At first, I didn't think much of it. She always loved her art. But then, it started to feel like she was disappearing. We used to talk about everything, our plans, our dreams, even the stupid little things that made us laugh. But now, it was like we were living in two different worlds. I'd come home from work, and she'd be there, but she wasn't really there. She'd be lost in whatever project she was working on, completely absorbed. When we did talk, it wasn't the same. She'd talk about her art, her new ideas, but there was this distance between us, like she was speaking a different language. I knew something was off, but I didn't know how to address it. She wasn't saying anything, and neither was I. Maybe I didn't want to hear it. Maybe I didn't want to admit that we were slowly drifting apart. I mean, we were fine, right? We weren't fighting, we weren't arguing. But that was the problem, wasn't it? There was no spark, no excitement, no connection. And I felt it deep in my gut. I wanted to ask her about it, to talk to her about what was going on in her mind. But I didn't know how. I was afraid of what she might say. Afraid she might tell me that she wasn't happy. That she didn't see a future with me anymore. Because deep down, I think I knew that was coming. I just didn't want to face it. What made it worse was that I didn't even know if I was still the same person she fell in love with. I didn't recognize myself anymore. I was so caught up in my own confusion, I didn't know what I wanted, what we wanted. And every day, it felt like we were just going through the motions, pretending everything was fine, while underneath it all, we were both unraveling. I knew Emma had dreams, art, travel, freedom, but she was pushing those dreams aside for the life we built together. And I hated myself for it. I hated that I was holding her back without even realizing it. Maybe she was starting to realize what I was too afraid to admit, that we were both stuck. Stuck in a life that didn't fit us anymore. It wasn't just the feeling of distance between us that bothered me. It was the growing weight on my chest. I could feel myself pulling away too, but I didn't want to admit it. I didn't want to face the truth, that maybe we were both better off apart. But the thought of actually doing something about it terrified me. I spent nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything. About Emma. About the life we'd built. I thought about all the things I'd been too scared to confront. My own failures, my own fears. I kept wondering, is this it? Is this the best I can do? What if I'm just another guy who's too afraid to take the next step? To walk away, to risk it all, even if it means losing her? I kept hearing my father's voice in my head, how he always said that a man should do whatever it takes to protect his family. He never said anything about letting go, about stepping back. I was so scared of losing my place, losing her, losing everything. But I started to wonder if the life I was holding on to wasn't really the life we both needed. Emma's not the same person she was when we first met. I'm not either. But the worst part, I wasn't sure I even wanted to be the person I was becoming. I was lost. I asked myself if this was really what love looked like. Was love about holding on tight and never letting go? Or was it about giving someone the space they needed to grow, even if that meant risking it all? I could feel it in my bones. If I didn't let go, I'd only be holding her back. I'd be holding myself back. And deep down, I knew it wasn't fair to either of us. But how do you walk away from the one person you thought you'd be with forever? How do you choose to let go when everything inside you tells you to hold on? Every time I tried to picture the future, all I saw was this endless loop of the same thing. More work, more pressure, more of the same. And I hated it. I hated the idea of living the rest of my life like this. But what if I let her go, and she never came back? What if she found someone else? What if, by letting go, I lost everything I thought I wanted? But then I realized something that shook me. Maybe the only way to really love her was to let her be herself. To let her grow. To let her chase the dreams she had before we met. And that scared me. Because love, real love, means accepting that sometimes you have to make the hardest choice, even if it feels like you're shattering everything you thought you knew. The decision wasn't easy. It never is. But I reached a point where I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to face the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I loved Emma, but I wasn't sure we were the right fit for each other anymore. And deep down, I knew I wasn't doing her, or myself, any favors by pretending everything was fine. One night, after weeks of avoiding the conversation, I finally did it. I told her. I don't think I'd ever seen her so quiet. It was like the air between us thickened, and I could feel the weight of everything hanging in that silence. I told her I needed space. That we both needed space. I didn't know if we were still right for each other, and I wasn't sure I knew what love was anymore. It felt like we were both stuck in something we didn't know how to get out of. I saw the hurt in her eyes, the same way I felt it in my chest. But there was also something else, something I hadn't expected. There was understanding. Maybe even relief. She didn't say anything at first, just sat there, listening. I wasn't sure if she agreed or if she was just waiting for me to say the right words. I told her I didn't want to hurt her, but I didn't think we could keep living this way. We were both changing, and maybe that meant we needed different things. I didn't want to hold her back, and I didn't want to be held back either. I think in that moment, we both knew that something had shifted. The hardest part was realizing that love wasn't enough. Not when we were both stuck in a life that wasn't right for either of us anymore. And the hardest part was seeing her face when I said the words. I think we need to let go. She didn't fight me. She didn't scream or cry. She just nodded, and I could tell she was holding it together. But we both knew this was the end of something. The end of what we had built. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a huge fight. It was just done. Walking away from her that night felt like the hardest thing I'd ever done. I don't think I've ever felt more broken in my life. I loved her. But I also knew that sometimes, love means letting go. Even when it hurts like hell. The days after the breakup felt like a blur. The house that once felt like a home now felt empty, hollow. I didn't know what to do with myself. I was drowning in silence. There was no Emma's laughter, no soft hum of the TV in the background, no shared moments at dinner. It was just me. And the weight of what I'd done. I kept asking myself if I made the right choice. Could I have done something differently? Maybe I could have tried harder, pushed through, but then I'd remember how much we'd changed. How much I'd changed. And I'd realize that I couldn't keep pretending. Not when I wasn't even sure who I was anymore, let alone who we were together. I found myself getting lost in small things, making breakfast, cleaning the house, going for long walks to try and clear my mind. But nothing really worked. My thoughts kept circling back to Emma. What was she doing? Was she okay? I wanted to check in, to know if she was handling it the way I was, but I also knew I couldn't. I had to let her go, just like I had to let go of myself. I tried to focus on my work, but it didn't help. I was going through the motions, trying to bury the hurt, but the emptiness just wouldn't go away. I'd find myself sitting in the same spot, looking at the empty chair across from me, imagining Emma sitting there, smiling. And it hurt. It hurt in ways I couldn't explain. Because even though I knew we weren't right for each other anymore, I still loved her. There were moments when I felt like I was losing my mind. I'd pick up my phone, ready to text her, to ask if we could talk, but I'd stop myself. I knew I couldn't. Not yet. I had to go through this, alone. The hardest part was the guilt. The feeling that maybe I had failed her. Failed us. But I also knew, deep down, that sometimes love isn't about keeping someone with you at all costs. Sometimes, love is about letting go, giving them the space to find themselves, even if it means losing them in the process. And maybe, just maybe, I had to let myself find me again too. I spent days like this, stuck in a loop of doubt and sorrow. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I couldn't stay where I was. I needed to heal. I needed to figure out who I was, without Emma, without this life we'd created, and it was painful. So painful. But as the days passed, I started to feel a glimmer of something else. Something that was buried under all the sadness. Maybe there was a future for me, outside of the man I thought I was supposed to be. Maybe there was a chance to rediscover my dreams, but that was a thought I could barely hold on to. Because right now, I was just trying to survive the emptiness. Just when I thought I was starting to get a handle on things, life threw me a curveball I didn't see coming. It had been a few weeks since Emma and I broke up, and I was still wrestling with the aftermath. Every day felt like I was walking through fog, just trying to get by, to rebuild some sense of normalcy. I didn't know what I was looking for, answers, peace, or just some kind of direction. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, one step at a time, and then, one evening, out of nowhere, I got a call. It was from Emma. At first, I thought I might have misheard the ring, but when I saw her name pop up on my screen, I froze. I wasn't sure if I was ready for this. It had been too quiet for too long. She hadn't reached out, and I hadn't either. I didn't know what she wanted, but I had to pick up. "Hey, Jack. I've been thinking a lot," she said. Her voice sounded different. Softer, almost like she'd been waiting for the right moment to say something she had been holding back. I braced myself for what was coming. I thought she was going to ask me why we broke up. I thought she was going to tell me she regretted it. But instead, she said something I wasn't prepared for. "I've been working on myself. I don't know if it's the right time, but I think we've both been running from the truth. From each other, but also from ourselves. I know we've both been lost in all the stuff that wasn't really us." I didn't know how to respond at first. It felt like she was saying the same thing I had been feeling for weeks, but now, she was saying it from a place of clarity, like she'd figured out something I hadn't. "I know you're still hurt, and I am too," she continued. "But I'm not calling because I want us to get back together. I just wanted to tell you that I understand now. We weren't the problem. We just lost ourselves." I was stunned. I wasn't ready for this conversation. I wasn't ready to hear that Emma had found some kind of peace that I was still searching for. But in a strange way, it made me feel like I wasn't so alone anymore. "Emma, I didn't know what to say. I don't know if I'm ready to hear this. I don't know if I'm ready to let go of the past. But I can't help but feel like you're right. We both need to find ourselves again." And then, for the first time in weeks, I realized something. Maybe this wasn't the end of our story. Maybe it was just a new chapter. I couldn't tell her that night that I was ready to jump back into something with her. But I could tell her I was starting to understand. I was starting to see that this breakup wasn't the end. It wasn't about failure or losing everything we built. It was about growth. It was about letting go, not because we didn't care, but because we needed to become whole people again. We talked for a while longer, but it wasn't the same kind of conversation we'd been having before. There was no blame, no anger. Just two people, trying to make sense of what had happened, and figuring out how to move forward, whether together or apart. In that moment, I realized something important. I wasn't as lost as I thought. After the conversation with Emma, something shifted. I didn't have all the answers, and I wasn't anywhere near fixed, but for the first time in a while, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it was because I had finally been able to talk about all the things I'd been holding in. Or maybe it was just that Emma and I were starting to see things from the same perspective. Whatever it was, I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't keep living in the past. I started making small changes. I began taking better care of myself, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. I started doing the things I'd neglected for so long. Things that once brought me joy. Things I had forgotten in the rush of life, working on my own hobbies. Getting back into fitness, even picking up that old book I'd been meaning to read for months. For the first time in ages, I felt like I was taking the time to listen to myself, instead of just going through the motions. I also started reflecting on the relationship with Emma. It wasn't all bad, not by a long shot. But there were things I'd ignored, things we both had ignored, because we were too focused on getting the right life, the perfect life, as society told us we should. And I began to realize, maybe there's no such thing as perfect. Maybe perfect doesn't exist. Maybe all we can do is be honest, be true to ourselves, and allow ourselves the space to grow. I spent a lot of time thinking about love and what it really means. It's not about possession. It's not about holding someone hostage to your expectations. Love is about freedom, the freedom to be yourself, to change, to evolve, and to grow together or apart, as life demands. I started getting out more, connecting with old friends I hadn't seen in years. I rejoined a painting class I had dropped years ago. For the first time, I began to feel like I was building something for myself, not just for a life I thought I should have. I also realized how much I had been afraid of being alone. I always thought I needed someone else to complete me, that my happiness was somehow dependent on being in a relationship. But the truth is, I had been my own biggest obstacle. I hadn't allowed myself the space to figure out what I wanted, who I wanted to be, and the more I worked on myself, the more I felt like I was uncovering a new version of myself. A version that was independent, whole, and capable of creating a future that was mine alone. It wasn't about Emma, or anyone else. It was about me, for once. The healing wasn't a straight line, though. There were days when I felt like I'd made no progress, days when the loneliness hit hard again. But there were also days when I felt like I was on the verge of something new, something exciting. Days when I could breathe freely and not feel the weight of my past mistakes holding me back. And little by little, I started to realize that the pain of the breakup wasn't just a loss. It was an opportunity. An opportunity to grow. To find out who I was outside of a relationship. To become the person I always wanted to be, but had forgotten about in the process of living for others. I wasn't done yet. I was still healing. But I could see a future now. A future where I wasn't defined by my past, by Emma, or by the life I thought I should have. It wasn't about erasing the past, but about moving forward with the lessons I'd learned, the growth I'd achieved. A few months had passed since Emma and I had that conversation, and I was in a very different place than I was when it all started. I was no longer that guy who thought the only way to be happy was to have everything figured out. I'd stopped chasing the perfect life. I'd stopped chasing anyone, including myself. Instead, I was focused on just living my life as it came. The loneliness that had once felt suffocating no longer felt like an enemy. It became a companion in my journey, a reminder that I didn't need anyone to define me. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone, not even to Emma. The truth was, I had spent so much of my life thinking I needed her or anyone else to complete me. But now, I knew the most important relationship I had was with myself. But here's the thing, while I was busy growing, Emma was too. She had spent that time focusing on her own journey, just like I had. She had started traveling, showing her work in local galleries, reconnecting with herself in ways I never even realized she needed. She wasn't the person she was when we first met, and neither was I. One evening, she called again. I picked up, expecting to hear about how her art was going or what she had been up to, but what she said took me by surprise. "Jack," she said softly, "I've been thinking a lot lately. About us. About what we used to have." I felt a familiar ache in my chest, but it was different now. I wasn't as desperate for her answer. I wasn't waiting for her to fill in the blank spaces in my life. I could hear the uncertainty in her voice, and I realized something important. I wasn't afraid of what she might say anymore. "I don't know what the future holds," she continued. "But I wanted to tell you that I'm proud of the person you've become. And I hope you're proud of yourself, too." For the first time, I didn't feel a need to fix anything. I didn't feel like I had to rush towards some resolution or force a happy ending. I just let the conversation flow, and in that moment, I realized something profound. We were both finally free. We were free from the pressure to live up to some idea of perfection. Free from the idea that we had to stay together just because we had once been in love. Free to explore life on our own terms, without guilt, without fear. It wasn't a dramatic reunion. We didn't pick up right where we left off, and that was okay. We both knew that the love we shared had been real, but it wasn't enough to keep us in the same place forever. And maybe that was part of the beauty of it. We weren't the same people anymore. And neither was I. As I stood there in that quiet moment, looking out at the horizon, I felt a calmness settle in. The future wasn't set in stone, and that was perfectly fine. I didn't have to control everything. I could just live. I could just be. I didn't know where Emma's path would take her, or where mine would lead. But I did know that whatever happened, we had both grown. We had both learned that sometimes love means letting go, even when it's the hardest thing you'll ever do. But letting go doesn't mean the end. It's just the beginning of something new, something better. Something that starts with learning to love yourself first. Only then can you truly embrace the world and the people in it. As I walked forward into this new chapter of my life, I realized something else. I was no longer afraid. I wasn't afraid of being alone, of failing, or of facing the unknown. Because I had finally figured out what it meant to live for me. And in that I had found peace.